briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to start by thanking USG ERC Fletcher and Executive Director Russell for their sobering briefings and to thank them for the courage and the work of their teams on the ground. The United Kingdom, together with Denmark, France, Greece and Slovenia, called for this meeting out of deep concern for the Israeli government's inhumane approach to the crisis in Gaza. This week marks 650 days since the horrific Hamas attacks of October 7th. With each day that passes, the hostages suffer yet more agony, in appalling conditions and deprived from contact with their loved ones. And with each day that passes, the people of Gaza suffer death, desperation, and displacement. This conflict has gone on for far too long. There is a deal to be done. We urge the parties to engage in the spirit of compromise to secure an immediate ceasefire, the release of the hostages, and a pathway towards lasting peace. I'll make 3 points. First, it is imperative that Israel lift its restrictions on aid entering Gaza. Without fuel, water systems and hospitals in Gaza are on the verge of collapse. Without medical supplies, treatable illnesses are costing lives. And without food, Palestinians are dying from malnutrition or forced desperately to scramble for supplies. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has acknowledged that the UN has the unique capacity to meet the immense humanitarian need. So we call on Israel to allow the UN to save lives immediately and without obstruction. The United Kingdom welcomes the agreement between the EU and Israel, but we need to see words turned into action. Second, we strongly oppose the expansion of Israel's military operations. We urge Israel immediately to implement and enforce robust measures to protect civilians. In the past 4 months, more than 1,000 children have been killed. Palestinians have also been fired upon by the IDF while desperately seeking food, with 800 people killed at aid sites. This is abhorrent. Third, the United Kingdom is appalled by the Israeli Defense Minister's comments on forced displacement of Palestinians to Rafah. This would contravene the fundamental principles upon which the UN was founded. Palestinian territory must not be reduced, and civilians must be able to return home. President, the path forward lies in diplomacy and compromise to deliver lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. We commend the leadership of France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in co-chairing the upcoming conference on a two-state solution, which offers us a crucial opportunity to advance this goal. I thank you.
Denmark for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with our British, Danish, Greek and Slovenia partners, we called for this council meeting because there is an urgent need, therefore. I wish to thank the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Tom Fletcher. I also thank Executive Director of UNICEF, Ms. Catherine Russell, for their briefings. mean that comments are not enough. They're brutal in the detail they describe, and they push the Council to move from words to action. First of all, Israel must be reminded that it must respect international law and that it is bound by its obligations towards the Palestinian population, particularly the people in Gaza. Israel must put an end to its blockade on humanitarian aid. The distribution system managed by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is unacceptable. It is incompatible with the obligations under international law and the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality and independence. Since the opening of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution centres, hundreds of people have lost their lives during food distributions and thousands have been wounded. This is unconscionable. Humanitarian aid, what's more, must never be instrumentalized to serve political ends. It must enter Gaza immediately and at scale. It must do so safely and unimpeded, and it must reach every civilian in need. This in accordance yet again with international humanitarian law. Secondly, the Council must call upon Israel to fully implement its commitments, namely those pursuant to the agreement signed with the European Union on July 10th. That agreement should make it possible to increase the unimpeded delivery of aid. This assistance, as provided for by the agreement, must be provided by the United Nations and its partners. They are the only stakeholders with the capacity to deliver aid while stringently adhering to humanitarian principles and with all possible guarantees regarding the proper distribution of the aid. Of course, food aid, but beyond food aid, medical aid and all other types of aids. All aid to guarantee the survival of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who have the right to that assistance and to protection. The Council must reiterate its support to the United Nations and its humanitarian work. However, for as long as Gaza remains an active war zone, this aid will fall short of need. This Council must continue to call for an immediate, comprehensive and lasting ceasefire, as well as for the release of all hostages that remain detained by Hamas. They must be unconditionally released. These are the only ways to guarantee the real protection of people and sustained humanitarian access. Proposals for agreements have been presented. Talks must now forge ahead on this basis in good faith, and once again we commend the tireless mediation efforts made by Qatar, the United States, Egypt, and we support these efforts. Finally, the extremely grave nature of the humanitarian situation in Gaza reminds us every day that it is urgent to strive for a political settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is the only solution able to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Israeli and Palestinian people for peace and security. It is in this spirit that France and Saudi Arabia will, on the 29th and 30th in New York, co-chair the International Conference on the Implementation of the Two-State Solution held under the aegis of the GA. This is not a utopia, it's not a pipe dream, that two-state solution. It is a pathway towards a future. The 8 working groups will work under the UN umbrella, and they will identify tangible ways forward to bring the two-state solution to fruition, to once again restore a political horizon for the benefit of Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
And I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин
Mr. President, I would like to thank the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Tom Fletcher, and the Executive Director of UNICEF, Catherine Russell. We thank them for their briefings, which showed us the true scale of the tragedy of Palestinian civilians continuing in Gaza. Day in, day out, we are seeing the humanitarian situation there, which is plumbing new and new depths. People in the Strip are living under the conditions of full-scale humanitarian disaster, and they are facing unfathomable hardship and hunger, which kills the adults and children. At the same time, despite the efforts by the humanitarian agencies and basically unanimous support from the Security Council, the humanitarian assistance, which is something that essentially all people in the Strip depend, is arriving in highly restricted amounts, and which are clearly not commensurate with the scale of the disaster. The situation is worsening quickly while there's a critical shortage of fuel, which is needed for the functioning of the basic infrastructure. Without fuel, what could happen is a complete paralysis of the hospitals, water supply systems, and food distribution centers, and that threatens the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. We are particularly worried by the news that there is a possible stoppage of the water desalination facilities. It's unacceptable to have the people in Gaza, children first and foremost, that they are left without access to drinking water. The collapse of the water supply system can also lead to the outbreak of infectious diseases, which would further compound the humanitarian situation. Mr. President, the continued ground operations by the IDF and the artillery shelling throughout the territory of the Gaza Strip create truly impossible conditions, impossible for the survival of civilians. We firmly condemn these attacks, as a result of which civilians are killed and wounded. We are particularly worried by the consistent and clear pattern of strikes against those areas where people congregate looking for food, including near food distribution centers. According to the data from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, no fewer than 798 Palestinians died in the enclave as they were trying to obtain humanitarian assistance, and this is since the end of May this year. We're particularly concerned by a huge number of victims near those centers which are under the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and this is a mechanism, as many of us had warned in this chamber, instead of solving humanitarian tasks, has become a symbol of humiliation of human dignity and is life-threatening for those who need such assistance. Hundreds of people who died when they were trying to obtain assistance is a grim testimony of this fact. The work of this mechanism is dangerous for the beneficiaries and is morally unacceptable. We are convinced the UN Secretariat took the only right and responsible decision when they decided not to participate in this punishment, essentially, scheme under the guise of humanitarian operation. Let me recall here that very recently more than 200 NGOs launched a joint appeal to stop the work of this violent militarized mechanism, where Palestinians are faced with an impossible choice to decide whether they will die of hunger or while they're queuing up for their food ration. Unfortunately, despite all of this, Israel and the United States continue considering this mechanism effective, and they're bragging about the millions of numbers of meals that are supposedly have been passed on to the civilians and not Hamas. These statements are dubious at least and are not supported by the real situation in the Strip. One thing is clear here. If Israel assisted and not obstructed the humanitarian assistance supplies through the UN, then we would have at least a faint glimmer of hope that the humanitarian crisis would ease. Well, today we do not have such hope, and the massive collective punishment against Palestinians in violation of the basic rules of the IHL is something that's going on in front of our eyes. Mr. President, we are shaken by the recent strikes against the people in Deir el-Balah who were trying to obtain humanitarian assistance from UNICEF. As a result of this attack, tens of people were wounded and killed, and this includes 9 Palestinian children. On the 13th of July, in the Nusayrat camp, according to UN data, 7 more children were killed as they were queuing up for water near a humanitarian distribution center. These tragedies have become a frightful everyday occurrence, and we firmly condemn the killing of innocent civilians who were only trying to obtain the assistance that they vitally need. Such attacks undermine the very possibility of saving human lives and are a gross violation of international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, humanitarian personnel are also continue dying. There was another strike against the office of a humanitarian organization delivered on the 10th of July in Gaza, took the lives of 3 more humanitarians. This tragic incident once again shows how high the risk is that humanitarians are facing when they are doing their duty under the conditions of constant present danger. in parallel to attacks against humanitarians and the reporters who are covering Gaza. There is a true persecution unfolding against UN bodies which are out of favor, and this refers to UNRWA first and foremost, and this is the agency which for decades have been helping Palestinians with humanitarian assistance, education, and healthcare. UNRWA's uninterrupted and stable work is a guarantee of survival for the millions of Palestinians who are living not just in Gaza, but, as we all know, also in neighboring countries, the countries which took in refugees. Would like to underscore here that there has never been an alternative to UNRWA. And after UNRWA and the UN Secretary General, they went after the special procedures under the Human Rights Council. Such acts are not in line with the duties of a UN member states. They are in violation of the Charter and in violation of the Convention on Immunities and Privileges. This situation requires a very decisive international reaction. The protection and providing for the civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories is a duty of Israel as an occupying power. And this is not something that depends on whether or not it's acceptable for the Israeli leadership. We insist on unconditionally ensuring the safety of civilians. Unfortunately, all attempts by the international community to obtain the very basic principles of humanity being abided by are encountering an all-around support by Washington to its ally. Washington essentially gave to West Jerusalem a carte blanche on any activity against Palestinians. Mr. President, if anyone is thinking that the situation in Gaza could not possibly get worse, well, they're probably wrong. According to the information we are getting, including from Israeli officials, West Jerusalem is preparing a new plan to move 600,000 Palestinians in the so-called humanitarian city in Rafah, south of the Morag military corridor. And the goal here to, in future, concentrate all 2 million Palestinians there, having checked them against their links with Hamas. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philip Lazzarini, has already characterized this plan as, in essence, trying to create a huge concentration camp, the Palestinian inhabitants of which will be deprived of any prospects for their future. We would like to point out here that the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, also shares such an assessment, and he called this initiative a part of a general campaign conducted by the Netanyahu government to conduct an ethnic cleansing and deportation of Palestinians. It would be interesting to hear an assessment of this initiative from OCHA and UNICEF. Mr. President, unfortunately, Gaza is not the only area where the Palestinians are situations so dire. We're very worried by the situation in the West Bank. There we're seeing intensified operations by the Israeli forces, especially in the north. What is being done by West Jerusalem leads to massive destruction, worsens humanitarian crisis, and deprives the displaced families of any hope for a return. We regularly receive information about the killings and violence against the Palestinian, the seizure of territory, and the demolition of their buildings. And this is unacceptable. We call on Israel to immediately stop the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory to ensure that the people are protected and the humanitarian assistance to civilians is not impeded. They need this now more than ever. It's important also to stop the expansion of settlements, stop the provocations on behalf of the settlers who are publicly humiliating the honor and dignity of the Palestinians. Mr. President, we all in this chamber have said many times that ensuring unimpeded humanitarian access to all of the needy in the Strip under the conditions of a continued military operation by the ADF is essentially mission impossible. Furthermore, it's clear for everyone that using force so as to save the hostages in Gaza is something that has shown to be ineffective. And in this regard, we would like to call on the parties yet once again to reach an agreement on ceasefire with the help of the mediation, such agreements which would result in the release and the exchange of all forcibly detained people. In order for the authorities in Israel to finally lift the blockade of this sector, the Washington has to reject their unconditional support for West Jerusalem, stop covering their violations of IHL, and use their influence to stabilize the situation. We're convinced that there is no alternative to this here. This is the only way that the vicious circle of violence can be broken, and the relaunching of the peace process of the Middle East settlement on the two-state solution can be obtained. The ultimate goal here is to create an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders, with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting with Israel in peace and security. The many years of the Israeli-Arab conflict has shown that there is no other alternative peaceful scenario in the Middle East. In this context, we welcome the intent on the part of Saudi Arabia and France to convene an international high-level conference to support the two-state solution at the end of the month in New York, and we plan to participate in it very actively. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Tom Fletcher and Executive Director Catherine Russell of UNICEF for their sobering briefings. Mr. President, humanitarian assistance should not be used as a political tool. And aid seekers must not risk their lives to get life-saving assistance. Unfortunately, what we witness every day in Gaza for several months contradicts our fundamental belief. We are deeply concerned by the recent announcement by the UN that as of July 13th, 875 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed while trying to reach food. Out of those victims, 674 were killed in the vicinity of the GHF sites. Every effort to deliver humanitarian aid, including food, medicine, and fuel, should be encouraged. But what we should not overlook is that such assistance must be carried out in a safe and dignified way, in full compliance with humanitarian principles. Amid the complete restrictions of access to the international media, we still encounter shocking videos and overwhelming testimonies about each person's experience at the GHF distribution sites. Those witnesses are not only Palestinian civilians, but also now include foreign security employees and even IDF soldiers. Despite this situation, there is still a persistent lack of accurate and sufficient information. Despite this situation, there is still a persistent lack of accurate and sufficient information on the facts around the GHF aid distribution sites or near UN convoys, and this should not be ignored. As the OHCHR indicated, I quote, "It is not helpful to issue blanket dismissals of the concerns raised by the international community," unquote. A full and transparent investigation should follow. And more importantly, international journalists must be allowed to enter Gaza, witness what is happening, and report the details back to the world. Mr. President, the United Nations has repeatedly stressed that it is ready to work to relieve the extreme suffering of Palestinians in Gaza through the swift and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. We trust the desperate but confident voice by the UN. We are aware that the WFP is continuing its delivery of basic food items to local communities, and that the WHO facilitated entry of limited medical supplies into Gaza. However, ongoing restrictions to the requisite aid make it impossible for the UN to meet the needs of 2 million people in Gaza as hunger and violence surge. We thus call on Israel to fully cooperate with the UN to expand the unimpeded entry and delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza at scale through the UN's well-established and trusted delivery mechanism. We are seriously alarmed by the incessant reports by the UN that everything, notably food, fuel, and medical goods, are in desperate need as existing stocks run out. We call on Israel to help the UN. We repeat our call for the protection of civilians based on the clear principles of international humanitarian law, including distinction, precaution, and proportionality. The daily repetitious killing of innocent aid seekers, such as those killed last weekend queuing for water, including 7 children, must stop immediately, regardless of cause. Mr. President, last week we were hopeful for the finalization of a deal to secure an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages in Gaza. We sincerely hope that through efforts by mediators, US, Qatar, and Egypt, a ceasefire can be resumed in Gaza as soon as possible. As we are concerned by the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, we are also worried by the fate of the innocent Israeli hostages and the agony of their families. We thus hope that all remaining hostages brutally held by Hamas, both living and dead, can be unconditionally released and that an immediate ceasefire can be made permanent. We also hope that any deal to reach ceasefire can be a starting point for a durable peace in Israel and Palestine. Thus, we reiterate our firm oppositions to any proposal to forcibly relocate Palestinian civilians inside or outside of Gaza. Realization of mutual acceptance and respect is the key for lasting peace in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I thank the UK, Denmark, France, Greece, and Slovenia for their initiative in calling today's meeting. I also thank USG Fletcher and Executive Director Russell for their briefings, which are heart-wrenching. 21 months into the Gaza conflict, the humanitarian situation on the ground has worsened to an unprecedented level. The international community must take strong actions with utmost urgency to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe. I would like to make the following 3 points. First, humanitarian access must be fully restored. Under Israel's extreme blockade, Gaza is experiencing extreme shortages in all types of supplies for survival and faces imminent large-scale famine. 9 humanitarian agencies, including OCHA and WFP, have all warned that the fuel crisis in Gaza is so severe that all humanitarian operations are at risk of being halted. As the occupying power, Israel has the obligation to guarantee humanitarian assistance under international humanitarian law. This is also a clear requirement contained in a number of Council resolutions and the ICJ's orders on provisional measures. China firmly opposes the weaponization of humanitarian assistance and urges Israel to immediately lift the blockade and siege of Gaza so as to fully restore humanitarian access. Second, assistance must be rendered by adhering to humanitarian principles. As the UN has pointed out on many occasions, the militarized aid distribution mechanism launched by the US and Israel violates the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Not only is this mechanism not sufficient to ease the humanitarian situation, but it has repeatedly caused heavy civilian casualties. The use of force by the Israeli army against civilians seeking assistance in Gaza has resulted in more than 600 deaths and over 5,000 injuries. China strongly condemns the attacks against civilians and calls for accountability through serious and thorough investigations. The UN and other humanitarian agencies have built full-fledged systems with rich experience and therefore are capable of delivering humanitarian supplies on a large scale across Gaza. All parties should support the UN in delivering assistance in a manner that upholds humanitarian principles, while Israel is obligated to guarantee the safety and security of assistance and provide facilitation in all respects. Third, forced displacement of people must be stopped in Gaza. Since the start of the current Gaza conflict, Israel has imposed a large number of evacuation orders, covering more than 86% of Gaza territory, resulting in repeated displacement of more than 1.9 million people. Recently, Israel is reportedly discussing the establishment of a so-called humanitarian city in southern Gaza, and we are gravely concerned about that. Both Gaza and the West Bank are the homeland of the Palestinian people, not bargaining chips in political deals. Any attempt to forcibly transfer the Palestinian people is a grave violation of international law and Council resolutions, and must be firmly rejected by the international community. President, an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza is the key precondition for saving lives and easing the humanitarian disaster. While we take note of the recent resumption of ceasefire negotiations, Israeli attacks continue, with new innocent lives lost every day. These cruel facts have shown time and again that peace cannot be achieved by force, and that prolongation of a war only leads to more deaths and hatred. We urge Israel to immediately cease all military operations in Gaza. Countries with significant influence over the parties should act in an impartial and responsible manner and take strong and effective actions to promote a ceasefire. The implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. We welcome the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution to be held at the end of this month, and hope that it will give strong impetus to the political process of advancing the two-state solution. China will continue to work with the international community towards quelling the flames of war in Gaza, easing the humanitarian disaster, implementing the two-state solution, and ultimately realizing a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question. Thank you.
Representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to acknowledge Undersecretary General Fletcher and Executive Director Russell's briefings. Although I would take issue with some of the characterizations in Mr. Fletcher's remarks, which pointed the finger of blame solely on Israel, with one reference to Hamas. I will also address in my remarks how refusal to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is tantamount to dereliction of duty in the humanitarian space. Mr. President, the United States remains actively engaged in addressing the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Special Envoy Witkoff continues to work tirelessly to reach a deal that would free the hostages and bring about a ceasefire that will pave the way for peace and prosperity in Gaza and the broader region. Mr. President, before I continue, I want to state that we are aware of reports of fatalities at a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation site in Khan Yunis, and the United States mourns this loss of life. The GHF stated it confiscated weapons at the site and has credible reason to believe that elements within the crowd, armed and affiliated with Hamas, deliberately fomented the unrest. Regarding our diplomatic efforts, Israel has accepted proposed ceasefire terms. However, Hamas continues to stubbornly reject them. We would have a ceasefire today if Hamas had agreed to the proposal on the table. The responsibility for the situation in Gaza lies solely with Hamas. It is long overdue for members of this Council and the UN system to place the pressure where it belongs, on Hamas, which continues to prolong this war and hold 50 hostages, including Americans, Itai Hen and Omer Nutra, in captivity. Hamas has held them captive for more than 21 months. The United States will not rest until all remaining hostages come home. Mr. President, no one wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry and thirsty. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza. This should happen in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. And with respect to reported fatalities or injuries of humanitarian workers as a result of IDF fire, we wish a swift recovery to those injured and offer condolences to those killed. And we recognize Israel's ongoing commitments to investigate these incidents. I would also recall that on June 11th, we witnessed Hamas's murder of 8 innocent Palestinians who were working on behalf of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, attempting to feed their fellow civilians in Gaza. We condemn Hamas's murders in the strongest possible terms. And with respect to West Bank violence, to which many have referred, I would simply note that Ambassador Huckabee has stated that we have asked Israel to aggressively investigate the murder of Saif Musalat, an American citizen who was visiting family in Sinjar when he was beaten to death. There must be accountability for this criminal and terrorist act, and our condolences are with Saif's family. Mr. President, unfortunately today, we have heard many council members and aid agencies continue to defend a failed system rather than support the GHF as it delivers life-saving assistance to those in need. We would urge member states and the UN to support the GHF and stop echoing incorrect information that benefits Hamas and undermines the secure delivery of aid to civilians in Gaza. It is unconscionable that members of this council have focused on criticizing the GHF rather than condemning Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad for their continued abuse of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The result is an ever-growing credibility gap for the United Nations. The Security Council, member states, and the United Nations have failed to condemn Hamas's attacks against GHF personnel. Hamas has murdered innocent Palestinians and injured 2 Americans working for the GHF and attempting to feed civilians. In the previous system, Hamas systematically looted humanitarian assistance, turning aid into a tool of control. We saw during the previous ceasefire how the diversion of aid helped Hamas replenish its ranks. Hamas cynically exploited aid for its own purposes, leaving civilians to navigate chaos and lawlessness. The United States supports the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza in a manner that does not benefit Hamas. The GHF is providing crucial and successful. The GHF is a crucial and successful mechanism for doing so, distributing more than 76 million meals to civilians in Gaza to date. They succeed where the old system failed in preventing Hamas from using aid to stay in power. It has consistently been able to deliver aid to civilians and remains committed to delivering aid consistent with the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, independence, and humanity. The GHF is a results-focused alternative to a broken aid system, following through on President Trump's commitment to feed Gaza's civilians without supporting Hamas or prolonging the conflict. The United States supports creative solutions that securely provide aid to Palestinians in Gaza without supporting Hamas or other terrorist organizations, and welcomes the additional aid entering Gaza following the agreement between the European Union and Israel. The United States has worked with GHF to assist the foundation in scaling up and increasing its effectiveness. Mr. President, while no mechanism is perfect, this is a good one, and it is continuously getting better, and the UN should help it do so. We urge Council members to join us in supporting the work of the GHF as it delivers life-saving aid to civilians on the ground. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States and Leon for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Pakistan. I would like to join colleagues in thanking Under Secretary General Fletcher and Executive Director Russell for the compelling briefings. We appreciate and support your work. Certainly, to properly describe the situation was beyond vocabulary. For the situation was actually beyond belief, unimaginable in this time and age. We support your calls primarily for standing unequivocally with international law and international humanitarian law and for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Colleagues, Gaza teeters on the brink of total devastation, a man-made catastrophe where death stems not only from bombardments, but from the systematic dismantling of the conditions necessary for life. Over 58,000 people have been killed, more than 138,000 wounded, and the entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Hospitals are barely functioning as supply chains collapse. Starvation is being used as a tool of war, and aid, the last lifeline for millions, has itself become a perilous pursuit. Just this past week, on 12th of July, dozens of civilians were reportedly killed when Israeli forces opened fire near an aid distribution queue in the Gaza city. Men, women, and children were waiting in the blistering heat for food. Instead, they found death. This is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern that underscores the urgent need for change. On another sweltering July morning, 7-month-old Salam lay motionless in her mother's trembling arms, her tiny ribs protruding like fragile twigs beneath skin drawn thin by hunger, her sunken eyes too weak to cry, flickered faintly as UNRWA health workers rushed to assist her at a bomb-damaged clinic. For weeks, her family had wandered the rubble-strewn streets for infant formula, but without success. Aid distribution points had none. UN-run centers were either inaccessible, out of supplies, or under threat. As doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, Salam's breathing grew shallower, her faint whimpers fading into silence. By nightfall, she was gone. One of 67 children lost to starvation in the past month, while thousands of aid trucks remained stuck at Gaza's borders, obstructed by bureaucratic delays and militarized checkpoints. Salam's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was the unfortunate yet foreseeable result of a system that has allowed hunger to become a weapon of war, a reality so grotesque that experienced medics are now grappling with the levels of malnutrition they once only saw in textbooks. Colleagues, I wish to highlight 5 urgent points here. First, the current aid mechanism is clearly failing those it claims to serve. According to the UN Human Rights Office, 798 aid-related killings have occurred since late May. 615 of them at or near distribution sites. The UN coordinated system of more than 400 well-networked distribution points has been dismantled. In its place, a heavily restricted system under the GHF now operates with just a handful of designated aid sites. This forces desperate civilians to traverse active combat zones in search of basic necessities. While some aid has trickled into Gaza, the volume is vastly inadequate. Its implementation is flawed, and it falls far short of the standards demanded by international humanitarian law. Most gravely, the system has morphed into a death trap. Second, the denial of life-saving assistance, particularly infant formula, has reached indefensible levels. Newborns face imminent risk of death by starvation. This form of deprivation cannot be justified under any circumstances. Immediate, unimpeded access must be granted for delivery of essential supplies. Third, Gaza is in the grip of a worsening shortage of medical supplies, shelter, and fuel. On 12th July, UN agencies issued a stark warning. Fuel reserves had reached critical lows, threatening to shut down hospitals, water and sanitation systems, telecommunications, bakeries, ambulances, and humanitarian operations. For a population of 2.1 million, this is a catastrophic tipping point. Fuel, medical aid, and shelter materials must be allowed without delay. Fourth, the current aid mechanism sets a dangerous precedent. Replacing neutral UN-led humanitarian operations with a militarized, selectively coordinated structure undermines the neutrality and impartiality that are cornerstones of humanitarian law. The consequences will reverberate beyond Gaza, endangering civilian protection in future conflicts. Fifth, and most critically, this catastrophe is not inevitable. It is the result of deliberate choices, policies, and actions of Israel, the occupying power. It can and must be reversed. The international community must act without delay. The objectives are clear and widely shared: an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. And we appreciate the efforts that are underway to achieve that. The lifting of the blockade and restoration of full, unhindered, and impartial humanitarian access in accordance with international humanitarian law through the UN system, including UNRWA, the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners, the unambiguous rejection of all illegal policies and actions of the occupying power, including settlement activity, any forcible displacement of Palestinians from their lands, and finally, and most fundamentally, addressing the root cause of this crisis, the prolonged Israeli occupation and the denial of Palestinian rights. A just and lasting peace in the Middle East requires realization of the two-state solution with an independent, sovereign, and contiguous Palestinian state based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds, Al-Sharif as its capital. In this regard, we look forward to the high-level conference later this month to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, and hope that it will yield concrete outcomes. Colleagues, the world cannot stand by as Gaza is starved and shattered. Let us not grow numb to the daily toll. of lives. It is not just another headline, another ticker on our screens, another statistic. Behind each number is a life, a person with a story, a dream extinguished, a family torn apart. History will judge us anyways, but let us be judged by our actions on the side of humanity and international law, and not by silence and passivity. Thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. A couple members made very serious allegations of genocide. Mr. President, these accusations are categorically false, and they fuel anti-Semitism around the world. America fully supports Israel's right to defend itself. Israel has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and to address humanitarian needs. The loss of life in Gaza is tragic, but responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could stop the fighting today by freeing the hostages and agreeing to a ceasefire on the terms already accepted by Israel. I thank you.
The representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the observer state of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. More than 2 million Palestinians, half of them children, and for more than 650 days now, wake up without knowing if they will make it through the day, and go to sleep without knowing if they will wake up in the morning. Day after day after day. They spent every hour, all 15,600 hours of them, with death besieging them. For an entire generation of Palestinians, death is now much more familiar than life. 2 million people have to snatch everything out of the claws of death: food, water, shelter, time. They are being killed in the places where they are supposed to find life, killed in tents, killed while seeking food or water, killed in hospitals. Every single day has its share of tragedies. We speak of these today. 15 civilians killed, including 9 children, while waiting to receive treatment for malnutrition. 11 killed, including 7 children, while queuing for water because of occupation-made water scarcity and occupation-made food scarcity. And every day, 40, 50, 60 Palestinians killed while seeking food. We fear the world is growing accustomed to the unbearable, to the unacceptable. Imagine what it is to be a parent in Gaza. You know that any disease and any wound can be fatal for your child. You know that the family you leave to get food or water or help could be gone by the time you return. Do you take them to the hospital with the fear that they might be killed there, or keep them with you while they might die within your arms? Do you go get food and risk getting shot, or send a family member and risk losing them, or stay and risk seeing your children starve to death? Do you go get water, send a member of your family go get water at the peril of your life or their lives, or risk seeing your family die of thirst? Do you evacuate one more time, forcibly displaced again and again, and get killed on the way, or stay put and get killed where you are? Every decision they are making while we speak is a life and death decision. Every single day, every single hour, every single minute. But it is a Russian roulette with a bullet in almost every chamber. Whatever decision you make, most probably somebody is going to die. Every single family in Gaza is moving between one death and another as the whole world watches on. For 1 million minutes now. In Gaza, all paths lead to death. And our role, our responsibility, our legal and moral duty is to open one that leads to salvation. One that leads to salvation. Israel wants that path to be leaving Gaza. That was the whole plan from day one. In the words of Mahmoud Darwish, this siege will endure until we are truly persuaded into choosing a harmless slavery but in total freedom. They want to say, we chose to leave. We chose to be occupied. We chose to be oppressed. It is our fault. It's always our fault. That has been the narrative since the beginning. Didn't they say we were responsible for our own Nakba? That we left on our own, forgetting the massacres and the towns and villages destroyed? Let them leave, they say. This is Israel's solution for the Palestine question, a right to further and definitive exile rather than a right of return or a right to life and liberty in our ancestral homeland. Mr. President, humanitarian assistance like international law are expressions of our recognition of the value of human life, all human life, and of the inherent dignity of each and every person. States have rights, peoples have rights, human beings have rights. But Israel does not recognize our state. It does not recognize our people. It does not recognize us as equal human beings endowed with rights. They find it outrageous that anybody can dare be outraged by the fate they have reserved to our people. Mr. President, distribution of aid is distribution of life. It is about safeguarding life. We measure our success by impact, by the lives we save. We keep discussing trucks and how many meals were distributed, and we count calories, while infants are dying of malnutrition, while civilians seek food, water, shelter at the peril of their lives, while the infrastructure of life is being dismantled altogether. Aid must be delivered at scale. Aid must be delivered to all. Aid must be delivered across all of Gaza. This is non-negotiable. This shouldn't be a point of contention or debate or discussion. Israel has obligations as an occupying power to do so. We support an immediate ceasefire and the mediation efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to secure such a ceasefire. But that is not a reason, nor an excuse, nor a pretext, in the meantime, to continue killing Palestinians or to continue denying them the aid they are entitled to. Every day, a death sentence is executed against somewhere between 90 and 130 Palestinians. Their crime, the real crime they are being executed for, is being Palestinian. How is that possible? You heard Israeli leaders say there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, speak of human animals, and they are treating our people as such. What if we had said these words? There are no innocents in Israel. They support the occupation, they support the genocide, they voted for the people killing us or occupying us or subjugating us. They cheered while we were killed. That is not acceptable as a reasoning. No civilian can be killed based on what a group or a government is doing. No civilian can be held responsible for that and be killed for that. All civilians are entitled to protection, regardless of nationality, faith, or race, to be protected from being killed, from being taken hostage or arbitrarily detained, from being subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment, to torture, to forcible displacement. These are basics. These are the foundations of our international law-based order, and we still need to speak again of them because they are not being upheld. This continuous incitement and dehumanization kills and makes the most horrific plans become mainstream in Israel, including the crazy and criminal idea to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. Every day, it's been 650 days, every day, 77 children are killed or maimed in Gaza. Every day, 61 children in Gaza lose a parent. Every day, 10 children lose one or both legs. Every single day. The biggest cohort of children killed and maimed, the biggest cohort of child amputees, the biggest cohort of orphans. How is that possible? Netanyahu summed it up. This is a struggle, he said, between the children of light and the children of darkness, end quote. Why should one care about the children of darkness? All children are God's creation. All children are God's children. Here they are, those Palestinian children whose light shines over the entire earth and who were subjected to darkness. Hind, who was stuck with her family in a car, and after all the adults had been killed, her cousin Layan, 15 years old, was begging the rescuers to come and save them until she was struck by multiple bullets by Israeli occupation forces. That's when the world discovered the voice of Hind, begging to be rescued. Finally, she was also killed, and the rescuers coming to help her were killed. Khalid and Reem, we did not discover them like this. They were inseparable. We discovered them only when Reem was killed. And as her grandfather was holding his 3-year-old granddaughter, kissing her as if she was still alive, calling upon her, the soul of his soul, to stay with him. A few months later, Khalid also was killed. Yusuf, the 7-year-old, the youngest of his family, the boy with the curly hair, as he will become to be known for all Palestinians and for people around the world, also killed. The family of the pediatrician, Ala Najjar, who lost 9 of her 10 children. Only Adam survived. 9 of her 10 children. Sidar, Luqman, Sadin, Rival, Ruslan, Jubran, Eve, Rakan, and Yahya, aged between 7 months and 12 years. The Arafat family, the entire family found itself under the rubble. 13 members of the family were killed, including 7 children, in an airstrike, and the Israeli forces prevented rescuers from saving them. The images of Hala, 35 years old, as she was calling to be saved from under the rubble, will remain as part of the memory, collective memory of our people. And Salam, that you evoked, Mr. President, 6 months old when she was screened for malnutrition, only to die a few days later. One image among many of our children starving. I will spare you the images of our children burning. Dunya, who lost a leg in an Israeli airstrike, where she lost also her family members, her mother, her father, her brother, and sister. And Dunya, resilient, said, I will not lose hope. I will not give up on my dreams. I will become a doctor to help people. She was killed when a tank shell struck a children's ward at Al-Nasr Hospital a few weeks later. Hur lost her leg lost her family, her father, her mother, her 3 brothers. Doctors had to amputate her left hand entirely and the fingers of her right hand, and she had wounds at her head and legs. Siwar and Selina, 3 years and 21 months old, together in life and together in death. This image, unfortunately tragic images, are the ones winning this World Photo Prize by Samar Abu al-Auf, a photo of Mahmoud, 9-year-old Palestinian boy whose arms were severed and mutilated during an Israeli attack on Gaza. But also in the West Bank, 8-year-old Adam, he ran when Israeli occupation forces shot at him, his brother, and his cousin. His cousin was killed. And he was killed when he was struck by a bullet while he was running away, a bullet in his head, in the back of his head. Remember these faces. It is our duty to remind you of them, not to allow you to forget them. And remember all the children we can still save. In the West Bank, Israel displaced 40,000 people and destroyed entire refugee camps in Tulkarem, Tubas, and Jenin. It killed almost 1,000 Palestinians in the last 20 months, including 200 children. Palestinian villages are under incessant attacks by settlers and occupation forces from Masafir Yatta to Kafar Malik, from Taibe to Der Debouan to Sinjil, where Saif Muslat was beaten to death by the settlers, and Muhammad al-Shalabi was shot in the chest and died. And again there in the West Bank, rescuers too were denied to reach the victim for several hours until they could no longer be saved. The same patterns at a different scale. Rampage and burning, destroying, killing Palestinian families and homes and hospitals and schools and mosques and churches and cemeteries and infrastructure and businesses. Everything is under attack. Palestinian presence and life in the land of Palestine is under attack. What world is this, where Israel can claim it can kill anyone in Gaza? They are either terrorists who deserve to be killed, or human shield, it cannot be blamed for killing them. What if we accept this reasoning that a state cannot be held responsible for the people it kills? Is that the precedent? Is that the world we want to be living in? It is a genocide. Many observers say it, many independent organizations say it, many scholars say it from Israel and the rest of the world. And we blame Israel for these actions. Not Israeli civilians, not Jews around the world. They're not responsible for what Israel is doing. And many Jews around the world stand for justice in Palestine and elsewhere. They call it a genocide, and they fight to stop this genocide, and they fight for a future of peace. People in Israel also are able to say it, and we are able to say it around this table. And we stand with everyone, regardless of their nationality and faith, who stand for justice. We stand side by side, shoulder to shoulder. What world is this where one party can destroy a country and all the requirements of life and then pretend to be human and give lessons about the right to voluntary migration? Let them leave, this place is hell, says the person who turned it into hell in the first place. What world is this where a country can use starvation and thirst as weapons of war, and then under pressure to stop is able to turn aid distribution into a tool to advance death and displacement at the same time? What world is this where putting an end to massacres or to get aid to be distributed is subject to negotiations? What world is this where humanitarian is characterized to identify a so-called city that is inhumane in its design and its purpose? Terms are being distorted and rules are not only being breached, they are being obliterated. And it is our people who pay the price. What world is this where those defending international law are considered guilty and the perpetrators can never be held to account? Where Israel can be prosecutor, judge, and executioner, and then we will ask them to investigate their own crimes, the ones they were ordered to commit at the highest level of their leadership, espousing these crimes, pushing for these crimes, inciting these crimes, organizing and planning these crimes. What world is this where humanitarians trying to save lives are attacked and killed, health workers and humanitarians and UN personnel, and those killing them blame them for their death. What world is this where those documenting the crimes perish to silence them? What world is this where we need to say that aid is not a bargaining chip, not a method of pressure, not a weapon of war, not an instrument for displacement and forcible displacement? Mr. President, and I conclude, our role is not to be the narrators of this genocide, but to be part of the movement that brings it to an end. Our role is not to be witnesses and testify. It is to deliver justice and peace. The fate of a nation depends on the decisions that states are willing to take today to save civilians, to end the genocide, to achieve a ceasefire, to release hostages and prisoners, to deliver aid, to ensure the withdrawal of Israeli forces, to deliver justice, to end occupation, to achieve shared peace and security for all, shared peace and security, to save humanity and our international law-based order. This world is doomed and damned if it continues allowing for Palestinians to be killed in this manner, to allow children to be killed in this manner. Save Gaza so we may all be saved by Gaza. That will continue to be our call to all to act, states, individuals, entities, organizations, agencies. Save Gaza, or we are all doomed. Save Gaza so we can all be saved by Gaza. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin my statement, I would like to comment on the two briefings we heard today. Israel is engaged with various UN agencies in good faith at the highest levels, and it is unfortunate that OCHA has continued to abandon all semblance of neutrality and impartiality in its statements and actions, despite claiming otherwise and claiming to adhere to them here today in this room. While referencing the West Bank and events that took place all the way back in May, both briefers only addressed Palestinian casualties based on information that is presented by Hamas. If it is neutrality and impartiality that our UN colleagues adhere to, why was there no mention, let alone a condemnation, of the terror attack where a 9-month pregnant woman was murdered by Palestinian terrorists and her unborn son was seconded to his wombs 15 days afterwards? Mr. President, Roni and Alma Miran are 4 and 2.5 years old. Like many kids their age, they regularly make pretend phone calls on their toy phones. But unlike most children their age, when their mother, Lishai, asks them who they're speaking to, their answer carries a deep pain. The answer is always the same: Abba, Dad. They ask, "Where are you, Daddy? Are they letting you return to us?" They hug and kiss his photo, not able to physically do so for 21 months. Their father, Omri Miran, has been held hostage by Hamas in Gaza for 649 days. For those two young girls, that's nearly their entire lives without their Abba. Earlier this month, twin sisters Emma and Yuli Cunio, who were themselves abducted by Hamas alongside with their parents on October 7th, celebrated their 5th birthday. What should have been a day filled with balloons, laughter, and joy was instead a somber affair marked by absence and pain, because it was their 2nd birthday without their father, David Cunio, who is still held hostage in Gaza. Their birthday wish was heartbreakingly simple: we just want Dad to come back home. These are not isolated tragedies. These are not statistics. These are shattered families suffering each day in suspended agony. These are innocent civilians held by terrorists, a horror the world must never normalize, a horror that Israel will not accept. Mr. President, we meet today again to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with a briefing from UNICEF concerning the situation of Palestinian children. Yes, the suffering of Palestinian children and the suffering of children anywhere demands our attention. Yet the glaring silence of this Council about Israeli children, about hostages, murdered toddlers like the Bibas boys, on traumatized survivors who will never see their parents again, on children running for shelter as Iranian missiles rain down on civilian population centers, is more than a technical omission. It is a moral failure. Scores of Israeli children were mutilated, tortured, and murdered on October 7th. Innocent lives cut short by the barbarity of Hamas terrorists. These children were victims of an evil that this Council seems unwilling to address or condemn: Hamas. Instead, we're presented with a narrative that forces Israel into a defendant's chair, while Hamas, the very cause of this conflict and the very instigator of suffering of Israelis, but also of Palestinians, goes unmentioned, unchallenged, and immune to condemnation. Some in this Council seem to forget what caused the humanitarian situation in Gaza. To address the situation without mentioning Hamas's war crimes, hiding weapons in schools, firing rockets from hospitals, using civilians as human shields, is not a humanitarian concern. It is propaganda. And even this additional session held today, a week before an already scheduled dedicated Council session, plays directly into the hands of the terrorists who engineered this conflict. It does not support peace, but politicizes suffering. Rather than requesting concrete consultations to learn about the efforts on the ground, the Council gathers to do the opposite, to pressure one side while absolving the other. There is a serious effort on the ground to achieve a hostage deal. Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington last week to meet with President Trump and other senior administration officials underscored just how committed Israel is in its will to achieve a hostage deal. And Israel continues to closely work with the United States and with Egypt and Qatar on reaching a deal that would bring our loved ones home and would end Hamas's reign of terror. Israel will keep supporting the entry of food, baby formula, medicine, and critical supplies because we believe innocent civilians deserve relief from the agony that Hamas has caused them. But we will not allow that aid to become fuel for terror. And yet, even as aid flows in, Hamas does everything in its power to disrupt it. They loot supplies. They obstruct distribution. They intimidate international aid workers. They fire at aid convoys, steal fuel intended for hospitals, and hoard food for their terrorists. They turn the sufferings of the civilians of Gaza into a tool of leverage, and then blame Israel for the very hardship they manufacture. Anyone who truly cares about humanitarian assistance must be serious about condemning those who prevent it from reaching the people. Let us stop pretending that Hamas is a bystander to this crisis. They are its architect. So I ask, does this Council stand with the effort to improve the situation on the ground, or with those who obstruct it? While this Council speaks of humanitarian suffering, let us provide an update on the real humanitarian action underway. Over the past 2 weeks, Israel, together with international organizations, has facilitated the entry of thousands of tons of humanitarian aid into Gaza, using mechanisms designed specifically to bypass Hamas terrorists and reach the civilian population directly. These efforts have been coordinated with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has now delivered more than 66 million meals to Gazans. In addition, more than 7,500 tons of flour have been delivered to bakeries across Gaza, ensuring bread for families. Today alone, over 130 patients and caregivers, including children, exited Gaza through the Kerem Shalom and Allenby bridge crossings for treatments abroad. So perhaps it's time to put an end to the dissemination of disinformation by some in the Council regarding which paths lead to what. There are paths of cooperation and improvement. Earlier this week, on July 13th, nearly 100 tons of baby formula donated by UNICEF entered Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing, facilitated by Israel. We do wonder why this was omitted from the briefing this afternoon. It should be absolutely clear. The aid is for the civilians in Gaza, not for Hamas, and we will continue to facilitate it. Mr. President, Council members, one cannot claim to care about the children and people of Gaza while ignoring the suffering of Israeli children and hostages still held there. A mere mention, a single reference in a 15-minute presentation is not enough. The empty words will not do. You cannot champion peace while turning a blind eye to those who wage terror. If this chamber truly wishes to ease the suffering of all children, Israeli and Palestinians, then you must confront the root of this conflict, and that root is Hamas. Hamas has built its war machine at the expense of Palestinian lives and futures. It has robbed Gazan children of their innocence, indoctrinating them with hate in their classrooms, using them as human shields, and burying weapons in their schools and hospitals. Imagine what Gaza could be without Hamas, a place of peace, where children learn math, not martyrdom, where aid builds homes, not terror tunnels, where coexistence replaces hate. There are those who wish to work with Israel in good faith, regional partners who cooperate with us to bring hope to children across the region. It can be achieved, but it can only be achieved without Hamas. And it is time for this Council to speak and act with moral clarity to achieve this goal, with demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, deceased and alive, still held in Gaza, by condemning Hamas unequivocally for what it has done to Israelis, but also for what it has caused to the Palestinians, by designating Hamas as a terror organization it is. This is what the Council should be focusing on. Israel, on its part, will continue to work with the US, Egypt, and Qatar to reach a hostage deal and to bring all our loved ones home. Mr. President, to conclude, every child deserves safety. Every child deserves a future. That future cannot be built on hate. Our children, all children, deserve more than this Council's silence in the face of terror. They deserve your voice, and they deserve your action. And Alma, Roni, Emma, and Yuli deserve to hug their fathers again. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Hakan Fidan, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we gather in this hall today, the genocidal war of Israel against Palestinian people continues unabated. Over 2 million people are enduring unspeakable suffering in the Gaza Strip. Mass displacement and widespread destruction continue. Deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid is a daily occurrence. Civilians are being indiscriminately killed at aid distribution points as they try to access food and water. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. There is no single principle of international humanitarian law that is not violated by Israel. No need to mince our words. Let us face the stark reality as it is. 80 years later, the world has been once again witnessing concentration camps. A campaign of extermination is ongoing against a whole population. It doesn't make any difference whether you are a child trying to fetch water for your family or a mother seeking food for your children. You are the target of the Israeli war machine. This is a machine fed by hate, and this is a machine fed by impunity. This is only possible because some of us choose to look away even in the face of extreme suffering. This cannot continue. Mr. President, there has been no safe access to humanitarian aid in Gaza for more than 4 months now. The only effective means of delivering aid is through the United Nations. Alternative models compromise the impartiality and dignity of aid delivery. Aid must be delivered promptly, adequately, and without obstruction through all available crossings in full accordance with international humanitarian law and in coordination with the United Nations. The core humanitarian principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence must be upheld. Mr. President, to achieve exactly that from the outset, we have called upon the international community to take urgent action to prevent the spread of war. Israel is trying to implement a strategy of aggression, not only in Palestine, but also in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. There is a clear pattern here. If left unchecked, this pattern risks wider destabilization. This is exactly what's going on in Syria. Israeli aggression is threatening the fragile peace that Syrian people paid a high price to reach. These attacks are deepening the ethnic fault lines across the region. It should be clear to all of us by now, Israel doesn't want peace, Israel doesn't want stability. We should collectively make sure that Syria doesn't fall into a spiral of violence. The stakes are very high. The ensuing instability will affect the whole region and beyond. Mr. President, the recognition of the legitimate rights of Palestinian people and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine remain essential for lasting peace in the Middle East. That is why we will continue to work towards increasing the international recognition of the state of Palestine and securing full Palestinian membership to the United Nations. Mr. President, one fact is clear beyond any doubt. The UN Security Council not only failed the people of Gaza, it failed human dignity. It failed the very values and principles that the United Nations is founded upon. The crisis in Gaza has passed the point of being a humanitarian emergency. This is now a profound test of our collective humanity. We either pass this test together or fail as a whole. What needs to be done is crystal clear. Stop the Israeli war machine, stop impunity, immediate and sustained ceasefire now, unhindered humanitarian aid now, a renewed and urgent commitment to the two-state solution now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fidan for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the UN.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union deplores the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, and the levels of starvation. The EU recalls the imperative of ensuring the protection of all civilians, including humanitarian workers, at all times, as well as of civilian infrastructure, including medical facilities and schools, as well as UN premises. Mr. President, the European Union calls on Israel to fully lift its blockade on Gaza, to allow immediate, unimpeded, safe and predictable access and sustained distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale into and throughout Gaza, and to enable the UN and its agencies and humanitarian organizations to work independently and impartially to save lives and reduce suffering. The EU has consistently called on Israel to fully comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. After a meeting of the EU Council of Ministers in June, the EU High Representative, Kaja Kallas, entered into a dialogue with Israeli authorities on the humanitarian situation. Following that dialogue between the EU and Israel, steps have been agreed by Israel to improve the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. These expected steps include, among other things, the substantial increase of daily trucks for food and non-food items to enter Gaza, the opening of several other crossing points in both the northern and southern areas, the reopening of the Jordanian and Egyptian aid routes, enabling the distribution of food supplies through bakeries and public kitchens throughout the Gaza Strip, the resumption of fuel deliveries for use by humanitarian facilities up to an operational level, the protection of aid workers, the repair and facilitation of works on vital infrastructure, like the resumption of the power supply to the water desalination facility. We can already see some improvements, including delivery of fuel, reopening of the Jordanian and Egyptian routes, opening of a crossing point in North Gaza, and ongoing reparations of essential humanitarian infrastructure, but a lot more is needed. These measures are to be implemented with a common understanding that aid at scale must be delivered in accordance with humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and that measures will continue to be taken to ensure that there is no aid diversion to Hamas or elsewhere. The EU will closely monitor implementation of these steps. We welcome updates from our humanitarian partners in this regard. At the same time, the European Union continues to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the unconditional release of all hostages, leading to a permanent end to hostilities. The EU continues to fully support the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. The EU deplores the refusal of Hamas to hand over the remaining hostages. I reaffirm the EU's commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution, with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. We are ready to contribute to all efforts towards this solution and call on all parties to refrain from actions that undermine its viability. In this context, the EU will continue supporting the Palestinian Authority and its reform agenda. President, in this context as well, we look forward to the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of a two-state solution, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia from 28 to 30 of July. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lambrinidis for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.